Welcome to the Philosophy of Death and Dying. I'm your instructor, Alex Beard. In this video, I'm going to do three things. First, I'll talk about navigating the course in Canvas. Second, we'll talk a little bit about what philosophy is and how to do it well. And third, I'll give some general tips for success in this class. First up, navigating Canvas. This is a summer course. We have to cover the same amount of content and material that we'd cover in a general 15 or 16 week semester. So there's a lot to fit in. I think I've arranged it in a way that will be accessible to you. There are 6 weeks in the class and 6 modules, and each of the modules have content. That content includes things like readings, videos, discussions, activities for you to complete, and you're going to have to complete this in order. When you log into Canvas, you'll see that everything comes up under the modules page. Right now, I have these 6 modules all collapsed. I'm going to uncollapse week 1, and you'll see that you can only access the first 3 items here. And generally what's going to happen is as you move through the course, you'll have to do what comes on top before you can access what comes below. So in order to access this video, What is Philosophy?, you're going to first have to get through these 3 items. And you'll always know what you need to do next because it will always be the lowest thing on the list that you can access. I'd also encourage you to get started early in the week. And so I don't want you to get behind. Getting behind can be deadly. Keep in mind that Canvas due dates are misleading. And so you'll want to follow the syllabus as carefully as you can, and don't just rely on Canvas to tell you when things are due. So let me highlight 2 different types of discussion forums that we're going to have in this class. The first one doesn't count for anything, but it might be very important. It's the Q&A forum. Each of our modules is going to have a Q&A. The idea here is that you can ask questions if you think that something is unclear or you're confused. And if you feel competent, you know what's going on, then it's an opportunity for you to test your knowledge or to help others by answering questions when you feel like you've got a better handle on what's going on. And I often find that it's more helpful when students explain to each other. That sort of peer-to-peer explanation and clarification sometimes does more or adds to the other materials that I offer. I will regularly check in with the Q&A forum, and I encourage you to do that as well. But I hope that this can be sort of a crowdsourcing forum so that you can help each other. In philosophy courses, I generally find that when someone's confused or has a question, many other people have the same question as well. So don't be shy. Ask questions when you have them. When you feel like you have an answer, please help out your fellow students. Even if you don't get there in time to answer, maybe you can use it to check your own knowledge. The main discussion forum, which does count towards your grade, will happen on a weekly basis, but it requires more of a back and forth dialogue. There's different types of posts that I require, and there are multiple due dates within the week. So even though you'll only see one due date on Canvas, there are definitely different times in the week that you'll have to get in and be active in the discussion forums. And so make sure you read the syllabus carefully, and you also read the document that talks about how to succeed in discussions. That will help you walk through what the expectations are. What is philosophy? The word philosophy comes from 2 Greek words, philo, which is one of the Greek words for love, and sophia, the word for wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. A better preliminary definition, however, is the activity of finding reasonable beliefs. I think of philosophy as something that you do actively rather than passively. It's active in the sense that you have to think for yourself. You have to reason and make inferences. You have to examine and carefully think through the views of others. And you can do this by reading, by talking, by discussing. But the important thing is that you're doing something, you're investing in this. This is something that we do together, as opposed to a kind of course where you just sit there and absorb content. It's also about finding reasonable beliefs. A belief is reasonable when and to the extent that it is supported by reason and evidence. In case this is your first philosophy class, it might also be useful to just kind of highlight some main areas of philosophical inquiry. First up is metaphysics. This is the branch of philosophy that deals with reality and studies the nature of reality. So here we might ask questions about the existence of God, the existence of the soul, whether human beings are free or determined in the sense of free will. Another main and important area of philosophy is epistemology. This is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge and asks questions like, how do we know, and how do we know that we know? Logic is the philosophical study of argument. I'll talk a little bit more about argument. And finally, the last branch is axiology, which is the study of value. And we might think of value being divided into 2 further basic types: aesthetics, which looks at things like the philosophy of art, asks questions about the nature of beauty, and maybe even ask about connections between justice and beauty. And ethics is the branch of philosophy that studies morality. There we ask questions like what makes something right or wrong, what makes something good or bad, and we'll do some ethics in this class as well as some metaphysics, logic, and epistemology. Since you might be new to studying philosophy, let me give 3 basic ways that you can orient yourself in philosophy. Approach this course with the wonderment of a child. Plato, a famous ancient philosopher, said that all philosophy begins in wonder. Second, you can approach this class with the skepticism of a scientist. I encourage you to have questions, to question everything, and to make no assumptions. I think science is a good model here because scientists often try to let their beliefs follow the evidence rather than the evidence follow their beliefs. So it's about what comes first. And in the same way, we want to look at what are the best arguments, and then our beliefs should follow what the best arguments are. And in fact, if we maybe find that our own view is out of sync with what we think is the best argument, maybe that just means we need to come up with a better argument in favor of another view. If not, reject and or revise. It's also good to think about your own beliefs critically as well as those of others. It's important not to take any one article or one viewpoint, even if it's coming from me or instructor, as this must be the truth. Because in philosophy, we deal with lots of very difficult questions. These are big, sort of age-old questions about humans and human nature, and they're not easily settled. And so we do philosophical study and inquiry because we're interested in these questions. They're very important questions, but they're certainly far from settled. And so it's really important to come into not only with the wonderment, but also some skepticism. Don't be satisfied with the answers of others, but really press on and dig deeper. Third, I'd encourage you to approach this class with the precision and clarity of a lawyer. Now, of course, some philosophers are going to be very good models of writing with precision and clarity. They get to the point, they say what they mean, they're very clear and accessible. But at the same time, philosophy is oftentimes very dense and hard to read. And so be clear that you understand the meaning of the terms. Look out for technical usages of terms. Even terms that you might think you know. Many times, important philosophical matters come down to terminological disputes. And even in the case of introductory students or students who are new to philosophy, you might easily overlook the meaning of a key term because you think you have an idea of what that means. So make sure, if you're going to approach this with the precision and clarity of a lawyer, that you're going to be careful in the way that you write, discuss, and even the way that you read. In the philosophy of death and dying, I've divided this class in basically 3 areas of inquiry. And what you'll see here is that we do a little bit of each of the kinds of philosophies I detailed in a previous slide. The first 2 weeks, we're going to be looking into what's called the metaphysics of death. So here we're going to be asking questions like, what is the difference between being alive and being dead? We will also ask about whether or not death is final or the end. We might think of ourselves as physical bodies. Those bodies will die. But is there a way to survive death? So, for instance, is there a part of us that is immaterial, perhaps a soul that could live on or survive death? Second, we're going to look at the meaning and the value of death. So here we'll ask questions like, should we fear death? Is death something that's bad? If so, what makes it bad? We'll also even ask questions about whether or not we would want to live forever. So we'll look at the value of immortality if it is valuable. And finally, we'll look at the ethics of death and dying, and that will be in the final 2 weeks of the class. There, we'll look at notions of the good death, asking, is there a good death? If so, is that something we ought to seek? And that will lead us directly into the last week of the class, where we'll talk about assisted dying, like euthanasia or physician-assisted dying. And there, despite the legal status, we're going to look at really the moral status. So despite what our law says, we'll be interested to know whether or not it should be that way, whether the moral arguments support one over the other. And we'll find very good arguments on many sides of these issues. Finally, let me just say something about the whole, because it's easy to get sort of lost in the weeds. These 3 areas of inquiry for this class are also connected in important ways. So, for instance, you might think maybe someone has the idea that death is not final, death is not the end. If you have that view, then you might think that death isn't that bad. But that doesn't necessarily commit you to a view in the third area of inquiry, because you might think that perhaps hastening your own death or taking your death into your own hands would be something that could hinder you from achieving an afterlife. Or on the other hand, if death isn't that bad for you, then perhaps dying, even hastening your own death, couldn't be bad because it's really a way to transition you into a better or different state of affairs. So these are going to be connected in important ways, and as we move through the course, think about the ways in which what we've talked about in previous modules will help you think through other issues in death and dying as well.
Philosophy is not just about content, it's more about method. Philosophy provides you with various mental tools to navigate the world and ideas. Filling out your philosopher's toolkit, then, is not just important for succeeding in this course, it also provides foundational academic and life skills that will help you flourish in whatever you choose to study or do in life. When you come to a reading in philosophy class, the first thing to ask yourself is, what is the view being discussed? Maybe more than in other disciplines, philosophers tend to discuss multiple views in a single piece of philosophical writing. They often consider a prominent or commonly held view and then pick it apart with arguments. In the end, they may favor a totally different point of view or substantially revise the initial view in light of criticisms. So aim for clarity and understanding. What is the main point the author is trying to get across? Secondly, what are the reasons that are offered in support of that main view? What support or evidence is presented for the various views, and how does the author use those arguments to reach the overall conclusion? Why should I accept view X and not view Y? Notice that this is a question that's importantly different from should I accept view X and not Y? The difference comes down to being able to identify the reasons someone gives in favor of a position. And you can do this regardless of whether you ultimately accept the view under discussion. It's a very good exercise to be able to identify reasons that support a conclusion, no matter whether you accept the conclusion at the end of the day. What we're really talking about here is the evaluation of argument. Logic is the branch of philosophy that studies argument. We define argument as an identifiable piece of reasoning composed of statements. Statements are sentences that assert something, and there are two basic types of statements, premises and conclusions. Arguments must have at least one premise and one conclusion. Premises present reason and evidence in propositional form that are tightly connected so as to lead to the conclusion. We say the conclusion follows from the premises when they lead to it and to no other conclusion. In other initial course content this week, you'll learn more about arguments and how to successfully evaluate them. Reasons or premises aim to justify the conclusion, or in the case of ethics, to justify an action or attitude. Justification is the defense of a position or action in impartial terms. Impartiality is really important here. When we use arguments to try to persuade, we are most effective when we can present the reasons impartially in a way that anyone can accept. To make this clear, we might make a distinction between justification and explanation, or the origin of a belief. If I say that I believe death is final, that there is no life after death, and I tell you that I believe it because I was raised an atheist, that doesn't give you a reason to believe it. It just explains to you why I believe it. Likewise, if I tell you the reason I'm against suicide is because I'm Catholic, I haven't provided you with an impartial defense of my view. I've only told you why I have it, not why you should accept it. If I'm to convince you of either of these views, I'll have to provide justification in terms that you could accept, whether or not your background was similar to my own. A justification isn't an explanation of how you came to believe something, but a reason why you or anyone should accept a belief. How do we respond to or evaluate arguments? Again, I encourage you to not accept any argument at face value, but to think deeply about whether the reasons offered in support are good. Do they really give you reason to accept the conclusion? If not, why not? There are different ways an argument can go wrong, as we'll learn about in some of the upcoming material. But for present purposes, let me introduce two ways to respond to arguments: objections and counter-arguments. An objection grants as much as possible to the argument, but provides reason to think that the premises fail to adequately support the conclusion. To do this well, you'll need an argument. You can argue that one of the premises is false, or that as it stands, the premises are incomplete, like something is missing. So the conclusion does not follow. In order for an argument to be good, it has to both have true premises, and those premises must be tightly connected such that they guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Philosophers refer to this as soundness, the truth of the premises, and validity, the structure of the argument. A counter-argument, on the other hand, is a unique argument that reaches a contrary conclusion. What we're left with is two independent arguments in favor of competing views. So in some respects, responding with a counter-argument looks past the original argument, unlike an objection, since objections challenge the original argument head-on. Counter-arguments then require us to examine further arguments to adjudicate between competing positions. In other words, we still have to determine which of the two arguments is better, since both can't be right. Just as any craft or skill, effectively evaluating arguments takes practice. This is what makes philosophy an activity. For the moment, here is one example. Consider the following statement. Suicide is morally wrong. Is this a premise or a conclusion? You may want to pause the video here in order to answer this for yourself. This statement is a conclusion. Someone could try to convince you of this, but they'd have to offer reasons. So here are 3 more statements. Do any of these count as reasons for the conclusion above? The first says, as a child, I learned that suicide is morally wrong. Next, suicide is the intentional killing of a person. And third, the intentional killing of a person is morally wrong. Again, you may want to pause the video to think about your own answer. The first statement is an explanation for how one has come to a particular belief. This is more of an explanation than a premise in an argument. The next 2 statements, however, could count as premises. In fact, they are tightly connected such that they would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. In other words, if the premises are true, the conclusion would necessarily be true. Notice, however, that I'm not saying the premises are true, just that hypothetically, if they were true, the conclusion must also be true. If you don't think that one or both of the premises are true, then consider offering an objection. We might ask if it's really true that all intentional killing is morally wrong. You might already have a counterexample. Self-defense, even when it results in death, may be morally permissible. If that's correct, then not all intentional killing is morally wrong. So we have reason to think that the premise, the intentional killing of a person is morally wrong, is a false premise. We could also launch a counter-argument. Here are 2 reasons or premises to support the opposite conclusion that suicide is not wrong. Suicide is a self-regarding behavior, and no self-regarding behavior is wrong. By self-regarding, we might simply mean actions done for one's own sake, determined to be in one's own best interest. Many actions that we do in our own interest do not seem morally objectionable. In fact, to neglect your own interest would seem crazy or even irrational. So this gives us reason to support a different conclusion. I suspect, however, that you have an objection in mind for this argument that works quite the same way as the objection to the argument above. While most self-regarding behavior is not wrong, perhaps some of it is. After all, we might think that selfish actions are self-regarding but also morally objectionable. So we have to ask whether suicide is among the class of permissible self-regarding behaviors or the class of impermissible behaviors. In short, we'll need more argument. Finally, let me close by offering some general tips for success in this course. First, read the material carefully and thoroughly. I make it my own personal goal to read philosophical articles more than once. I suggest you consider reading our material multiple times to really understand it. Philosophical writing is argumentative and dense, so it often takes care to unpack. Second, each module includes a primer. Use these as study guides. They appear early in the module to help prime you to the important ideas and give you some context for the writings, activities, and discussions. Most importantly, they help identify the key ideas that you should be thinking about when you complete the course content. The information in the primer is what I'll be asking about in the weekly quiz. Third, in a class like this, memorization isn't really all that helpful. It's not a class where you can simply memorize and then regurgitate information on the quiz to do well. Think about the ways in which course material helps form a web of key ideas and arguments. Consider what you find most and least persuasive and why. Next, and this is probably the best advice for any course, focus on understanding the material, and the grades will take care of themselves. Your goal shouldn't be to get through everything as quickly as possible, but to understand what you're doing. If you understand the content, you'll do just fine in this course. I'm here to help, so ask me, and ask each other too by using the question and answer discussion forums. Finally, here's a useful way to measure your own understanding. At the end of the module, can you clearly explain the key concepts and arguments in terms that anyone can understand? You might even practice by bringing up some key ideas for discussion with friends or family. As I've been prepping for this course, I've enjoyed asking some of the questions we'll consider to my friends and family. It's led to some very interesting discussions, so I hope you'll find the same. I hope you enjoyed this class and learn a lot too. I'm here to help you succeed, so let me know if there are ways I can help. Thanks for watching.